Joining us today is Carolyn Hamilton. She is a historian and anthropologist and the leading South African authority on the intersection between the archives and public culture. She has held professorships at the universities of the Witwatersrand and Cape Town and a national chair in the latter, but a national research chair in the latter. But in keeping with her expertise, she has also been involved extensively where scholarship interfaces with the public. That includes memberships of various boards and councils, including the Robben Island Museum, the South African History Archive, and the Nelson Mandela Foundation. And she has filled many other positions in her storied life as a scholar and activist, everything from being a founder member of the Gay and Lesbian Archive to being a speechwriter for Madiba. So here to speak with us about aspects of her life's work is Carolyn Hamilton. Welcome, Carolyn.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
To get going, can you tell us a bit about your background, including what guided your interest in history? As we're going to discuss, you were tenured as an anthropologist, but at least one bio identifies you as having been trained as a historian.
Thula, it's I'm definitely a historian who maybe found a little bit of refuge in anthropology at a particular point. So I started out at the University of Natal and did a history and history of art degree and so on, and was extremely shocked at the what I discovered there in a course that was called prehistory at the time, in other words, not history, that I knew nothing. I had my whole undergraduate to that point had told me almost nothing about African history before colonialism. And I discovered that a great deal of the interpretive spine for that period depended on ethnography. Ethnography is done mostly in the early 20th century. And I felt extremely anxious about those ethnographies. So that was one anthropological question in my mind. Was I going to simply take these ethnographies at face value? Did I understand that they were remarkable studies done in the 1920s, but were they the right sort of material to act as the interpretive spine for what societies before European colonialism looked like? So I had a query there about the nature of anthropology itself. So I went off to the Johns Hopkins University in the late 1980s, and there was a lot of interaction between history and anthropology. And I realized I needed to know a great deal more about anthropology than I did. What I didn't know before going there was that anthropology itself was undergoing an enormous critical interrogation of itself. And that had not percolated into anthropology at Wits in the 1980s when I'd been there, where most of the work was development anthropology or a sort of more old school ethnographic, the sort of maybe the dying stages of the old school ethnographic work. At Johns Hopkins, the critical review of anthropology looked at these ethnographies with all sorts of lenses that made one understand the ethnographies as productions of their own time. So in a way, they stood for and had spent much of the 20th century looking like they were studies of, and I'm going to invoke the stereotype here, timeless tribal life. But in fact, what the big critique of anthropology in the 1980s was showing us, they're very much productions of their own time, of the 1920s, the 1930s, the 40s, and even the 50s. That was of great interest to me. So the foray into anthropology was partly about trying to unpack for myself and understand how these big defining ethnographies were shaping the understanding of the earlier periods of Southern African history. So did I ever really think of myself as an anthropologist? I'm not sure that I did. I don't think that my methods are those of an anthropologist. They're very much the methods of a particular kind of historian. And perhaps we'll get on to that. So no, I don't think of myself as an anthropologist. I think of myself as a historian who takes anthropology very, excuse me, very seriously in terms of its own production. So how are anthropological texts produced? What happens in the fieldwork situation? When are they produced? What are the contingencies of the circumstances of their production at a particular point in time? Made me rather popular in anthropological circles in South Africa, I'm afraid, but we can get on to that.
But I mean, what you've just described is, as far as I'm concerned, one of the foundations of our field, or how it ought to be, and source criticism, essentially, in all ways, and asking the very, very critical questions, not only of yourself, but of the source, of yourself and of the sources and of the production of knowledge. So I really like that very much. I do also want to ask, though, your undergraduate studies, as you've mentioned, the University of Natal, and then also you were at Wits in the late 70s and 80s. Tell us a bit about the student life and the politics of the late apartheid period, because those were, one would call it, tumultuous years at these universities.
So I went off to the University of Natal because it was the cheapest university at the time in South Africa. So I'd done 1 year at Wits, and my father had died, and I found myself without any financial support. So I went off to the University of Natal, where I had to work every night. So I had a sort of limited social life, undergraduate social life. And the University of Natal, Pietermaritzburg, it was a highly divided campus in the sense that it attracted vast numbers of, and I'll use the older term, Rhodesians. And it had a very big agricultural faculty. So it had a particular kind of character, and it also had a small and rather significant left wing with hippie elements, let's put it that way. So it was an odd place to be. And I didn't find student life particularly interesting. However, and I didn't find the degree particularly interesting either. And I was trying very much to, do the hand-to-mouth income earning question. However, I did find one or two of the history courses absolutely astonishing. And that's when I did this prehistory course with John Wright, with whom I'm still writing a book. And, he was this sort of very grumpy, difficult, and absolutely inspiring history lecturer. And that really convinced me that I was interested in history, partly because of the shock of realizing how did I end up at 20 years old and know almost nothing about the history of the place that I lived in. I mean, how could that be? It was just so staggering. But also the course that he taught asked a whole set of questions about, well, how do you find out about a past in which there is no written record, and in which you have to rely on disciplinary experts in a variety of fields. And the way it was presented at the time was, well, you have to know about archaeology and linguistics and anthropology. It was almost as though, well, where did the history fit in? So I think a whole set of foundational questions were opened up for me at that point, which were simply astonishing. I think my eyes were on stalks. And I was going to carry on and do honours at Natal. And John Wright said to me, I think you should take yourself off to Wits, because there's a much more dynamic environment in the field of historical research. And of course, that was the heyday of the Wits History Department and African Studies under Van Onselen. So it was, and it's history workshop, it was very exciting. And there was quite a lot of work being done, mostly done in the 1970s, but also being published in the early 1980s on, and I don't want to say on pre-colonial history, no, on the rise of states so there'd be 1 or 2 chapters on the rise of the Pedi Kingdom, the Swazi state, the Zulu Kingdom, something, and then 5 or 6 chapters for the rest of the book on how that state intersected with early colonialism and usually the decline of that state. So there would be this, in these studies, there was this 1 or 2 chapters that looked back in time, but not with not much, not a great deal there, but certainly a commitment to using what were called oral traditions. So it was a good place for me to be with my interest in those questions. However, I found myself less interested in the demise of these states as they interacted with colonialism, which was the dominant question of the time, and much more interested in the question of what about those entities in their own right prior to all of this intersection and collapse stuff. So that's what took me to Wits, and I started a thesis there working in the history department, and I did an honours, and then I registered for a master's, which I finished in 1985, on the mostly focused on the rise of the Zulu Kingdom, which, you know, there'd been a number of papers written about this where people talk about ecological factors or demographic factors or trade, you know, mostly rooted in political economy. So showing how that kind of factor could, in theory, intersect with the little bit that we knew about those early entities, and the burden of the arguments were carried by the theoretical propositions. The evidence base was quite slender. So it was really interesting. But the people who'd been working in this area, people like Peter Delius and Phil Bonner, had started already to move away from it. Why? Because the source problem was so huge, and it was much easier to work where you had written sources. And so almost all of those scholars moved to areas that were much more well supported by contemporary documentary records. And also this was the time of the real heating up in the anti-apartheid struggle. So questions of labor history, of land dispossession, all the things that became most pertinent in terms of apartheid ideology and the challenge to it, those became the kinds of historical questions that people were interested in. These questions of what we might know or not know about the earlier periods were really shelved and in some senses taken over and dominated by people who put themselves in the position of speaking for traditional authorities. So it was a really intriguing period in which the kinds of questions that I was interested in were not the hot historical questions. On the other hand, there were some elements in the hot historical questions that gave a certain amount of insight into what one might do to pursue these earlier periods, particularly in literary studies, and particularly in the emerging field of African literary studies. Yeah. So,
because I find this fascinating, because I'm picturing you working on, and again, yes, let's say the terms are loaded: prehistory, pre-colonial, let's say pre-written record, in an environment where you're absolutely right. The focus is 20th century mostly, maybe a bit of 19th century land dispossession, labor. How do you function within an environment where you are, in a sense, swimming upstream? I like the idea that you utilize those questions to inform your research, but on the other hand, it actually means something of a lonely path. If I'm, but maybe I'm just making assumptions here.
Lindie, you hit the nail on the head. It was a very lonely path. And in fact, I even wondered whether my own teachers actually read my work, really read it, or did they grapple with my ideas, which were different from theirs? I think not. And so at a certain point, Shula Marx asked me if I wanted to come and do a PhD in London. And I would talk to her at great length about this. And I said, I feel like the Marxist historiographical establishment doesn't offer me much. Shula did, of course, because Shula was a very wide-ranging scholar. And she put me she gave me a paper to read. She was attending at the time, this is the mid-80s, a roundtable in history and anthropology, where all of these critical questions about how is history being produced and how is anthropology being produced. Not because anyone was particularly interested in the pre-colonial, but because those questions were so fundamental to my understanding of what you'd need to know in order to wade your way back through all these productions to try and understand what you might or might not know about these earlier periods. And so that's what took me off to the US and to the Johns Hopkins University, where I went to work with David Cohen because he was the author of an extremely influential paper that both Shula and I loved, and it was titled simply The Production of History.
There were many important oral history projects during the 1980s. It's known for that, recovering unwritten past. You spent a good time during the decade working on the Swaziland Oral History Project. Can you tell us about it and any leads it offered to your later research? So before we go on to your time in Baltimore at Johns Hopkins, just speak about your formation and how that oral history contributed, if at all.
In 1983, Phil Bonner, who had done his PhD and then his book, Kings, Commoners and Concessionaires, on the rise and consolidation of the Swazi state, asked me if I would undertake a research project to collect oral histories in Swaziland, which I agreed to do. And so I went off with only a fairly dim idea of where Swaziland was, and started the project. And in that, the then reigning Swazi king Sobhuza died in 1983. And so there was for a while an interregnum period, and then the appointment of a queen mother as the sort of regent. And so it was a very unusual time to be in the country and talking to people about the deep history of the country. I had no Siswati whatsoever at the time. And in fact, it's a comment I'd make about the profession and the history producing establishment in South Africa, is that it was assumed that somehow white scholars with no language skills at all could do these kinds of things. And I very, very quickly learned that that was not possible. So I had to sort of somehow pick up some language skills on the hoof, as it were. And I was very young, and a woman, a girl, actually, a very young woman. And so the complexities of how to negotiate my way into these quite rural areas with people who could speak a bit of English, but not much, weren't interested particularly in speaking English, who looked at me with a considerable concern, what was I doing, and so on and so forth. I mean, it just created a remarkable experience for a young scholar. And I spent years doing this. And I think, Thula, I learned that oral histories are not about collecting the story that you want and mining that story for a few facts, but in fact that you have to learn the dynamics of the discussion and understand how the discussion proceeds. What are the circumstances in the context of the discussion? What on earth what do the words mean that people use? I mean, there I was in Siswati, terms like tive is sizwe, right? Or izizwe. So what does a word like that mean? What does it mean in the 1980s to someone who at the time might be in his 90s, How is he using the word? What on earth does he mean by that word, right? How would I know what he means by that word? Because, or any such word, people readily translate words like that as nation and clan and whatever it is in various contexts. But trying to understand who's speaking with what history behind the use of a concept, or think of a concept like umbuso. What does it mean? What concept of sovereignty does it mean? What concept of sovereignty does it mean at the point at which the king has died in your country, when possible critiques that you have of sovereignty of the 20th century might be uppermost in people's minds? And when people are talking to you about not that kingship, but a kingship of 100 or 200 years earlier, what did they imagine umbuso looked like back in the day? Suddenly I realized the complexity of the exercise. So Phil Bonner was very keen that we should publish these interviews like the James Stewart archive, in volumes and volumes. And eventually he and I deadlocked on it because he wanted to publish them in English. I said to him, I can't trust any of these translations because the translations themselves are just handy indexes for an English speaker to get through the Siswati, or actually, what about Singuni in Swaziland at the time? Singuni was an Ndwandwe dialect with its own particular inflections and meanings, right? Oh, it's just like so much to know that we didn't know in the 1980s as the scholars who were in this project. And I think it's taken me all the time between then and now to feel like I can even use that material to produce a set of footnotes or an analysis. So that was what that project meant for me. But I did assemble a huge collection of interviews that I did with tremendous support from others, because I was not in the position to do that with any competence. And I also collected interviews that other people did, like from the Swaziland Broadcasting Corporation. There was this wonderfully dynamic Dumisa Dlamini who ran a history show every week on the Swazi Broadcasting Services, and he arranged for me to be able to take that archive, and we have it. And there were other Siswati speaking historians who themselves were recording materials. So I have all that. And funny enough, the king, before he passed, he himself had been interested in history and had an official recorder, a tape guy with a reel-to-reel tapes that they recorded stuff on. So we collected all this material, and I refused to publish it, much to Phil Bonner's annoyance. And now, in this much later life, it's possible to put the digital audio online and to put however rough the transcripts are online and however rough the translations are online, without running into the danger that the published authorized English text produced by Carolyn Hamilton would stand in place of all of that discourse, right? Which is a much safer position, I think. One can be much more comfortable with that, because people can use these various written versions to search the material, and then they can listen to the original audio themselves. And it's having a big range like that means that you can pursue a concept like umbuso across 100 different conversations. Say, well, look, all of these people are talking in the early 1980s, but look at the different ways they're speaking about this. I mean, it's just fabulous. Anyway, so that's how that project ended up. And I suppose there's, I'm always hesitant to publish. I think there are good reasons to be hesitant. There's an institutional system that demands that we publish, and you always know when the material is too raw, and you always know when you're just publishing to meet a target.
I will say you've just tapped into one of my passions, I want to say, in terms of, I don't know, the beauty of language, the complexities of language. I mean, I can spend hours unpicking, you know, meanings in the most pedantic fashion. So I find it so wonderful but important that you don't look at language in a way of, oh yes, just straight out translation, and the extent to which you or English can become almost like interpose yourself between the source and the person who wants to access the, you know, the material. But that's also something I've noticed that you've championed in recent years also, in terms of, let's say, our Indigenous archives, Indigenous languages, and a proper understanding of language in accessing, you know, source materials, as opposed to simply just, as you say, interposing translations.
Lindie, I have wonderful cohorts of students now who have and they have to have big ranges of language skills, because you know it's not enough to say, look, I'm an isiZulu speaker, because actually if you want to write about isiZulu topics, you often have to know what writers who, by the time languages are standardized, are writing in isiXhosa or Sesotho, who've got views on the same topics. You have to be able to move across languages. So the students that I like working with so much are the students interested not simply in using their contemporary understanding of language, but are interested in doing the historical research necessary to try and understand what a word might have meant in the past, which is different from what it may mean today. And to do that, you know, some of it's kind of like all dictionary research or discourse, and, you know, looking at instances of text and discussion at particular points in time. All of that's really important. But it's also important to understand the context. So why is a word changing? You know, you have to understand the forces for change in society to understand why the discourse is changing and how the discourse is changing. So it's not merely simply a language question or a philological question. You have to understand the language in the past, in society, doing changing kinds of work in changing contexts. So that's, and it's very gratifying to discover that a lot of young students today find the challenge of this kind of very deep historical research with its precisions. They really enjoy it.
Again, it's like candy to me. I like this kind of stuff. But I want to know, let's move on to your time in Baltimore and Johns Hopkins. Please do tell us about that. I mean, you had your MA thesis on the Sharkan Kingdom, and then your PhD at Johns Hopkins, authoring Shaka models, metaphors, and historiography. So definitely a lot of layers that you brought into that. Were there overlaps and continuities and discontinuities between masters and PhD?
So when I did the masters, the context was very much about how would you use oral sources. Right? So that was in fact, what were called oral traditions. And I've spent a lot of time becoming wary of the term oral traditions and the work that particular European term does in our context, right? When I got to, so remember I told you I was really taken with this paper that Shula and I read on the production of history. So I didn't even know where Baltimore was, and I don't think I'd even heard of the Johns Hopkins University. But I wrote to the author of the paper, David Cohen, and I sort of said, you know, I was really interested in his work, and I didn't really have any intention of doing a PhD. And he said, well, you know, Shula's given me your master's thesis, and you know, if you wanted to come and do a PhD here, you could, and so on. In the meantime, you know, there were many states of emergency were being declared in South Africa, and I was married at the time to someone who had a very difficult detention. And then we And also I'd been living in Swaziland, and Swaziland at the time was quite thickly involved with ANC politics and had it was quite a dangerous place, really. Yep. And I had on a couple of occasions helped people out of difficult circumstances. So I came to understand that my own situation was a little bit risky, and as was my partner's. And I decided to thought this was actually a very good time to do a PhD. So off I went to Johns Hopkins, which was a complete shock to me because I was very left-wing in my orientation at the time and hadn't really given the USA any consideration. Academics in South Africa were very UK orientated in their thinking, and it was absolutely astounding to arrive in an American history department, where, by the way, it was assumed that if you were going to work on an African history topic, you needed a couple African languages, unlike the South African situation, but also where one was exposed to things that I wasn't exposed to in South Africa, such as intellectual history, which was a big field, which had almost no presence in the South African Academy in the 1980s. And of course, intellectual history asks you to imagine the conditions of the production of knowledge, actually. Then, as I said to you, there was this big review and in anthropology, and Johns Hopkins was a hotbed, the anthropology department there, of this kind of new thinking in anthropology. In fact, somebody whose work I admire greatly, Rolf Trujillo, was in the anthropology department there. You may know his book, Silencing the Past, which came out more or less just a little bit before my own terrific Majesty book. And, he was a member of faculty, very influential. And then there was David Cohen with his production of history and so on. So it was really interesting to me. And in all, the upshot of all of that was to make me very conscious of focusing on how history was produced, history and ethnography, how sources are produced. There was a way in which I'd been trained to think of the source as something which was out there, that I would approach the source and sort of read it, use it, and put it in my footnote. And I suddenly started to understand that the thing that was termed the source, which was imagined as a rather inert thing that I would be lucky enough to find, how it had a life of its own and had been having a life of its own probably hundreds of years in one way or another. And how would I understand that? What in my time made me able to recognize this thing as a potential source when people earlier might not? What are the sources that I couldn't recognize as sources because my orientation didn't admit of the possibility that that other thing was a historian's source? I had all these ideas in my mind. And then suddenly the Berlin Wall came. I was just getting going. I'd done half the coursework and so on. And the Berlin Wall came down, and it was clear that Mandela would be released in a little while. And my partner said, well, actually, I think we'd better go home now. There's no need to hang around here any longer. So I just sped up and did what you're supposed to do, 3 years of coursework. I just got it all finished as fast as possible. So I didn't spend very long. I spent about maybe 18 months at most in the US, and then came home. And then, it was a very dynamic time politically. And so I was busy trying to write my PhD thesis. And then you asked, Lindie, how did the PhD thesis relate to the master's thesis? Now, the master's thesis was very much about what was actually happening, let's put it like this, in not just the 1820s Zulu kingdom, but also in neighboring and earlier political entities in the area. So in the master's thesis, I had a chapter on Kwabe, a chapter on Mtetwa, all sorts of things, and then some chapters on the early Zulu kingdom. And, if you've got a book that deals with, and I'm going to caricature here anything, but sort of anything to do with Zulu history, it has a huge readership market. So as soon as I finished my thesis, I got quite a lot of offers of publication because a Zulu book, it's like it's pretty hot currency. And I had thought to myself, I can't possibly publish this because I'd started to understand how little I knew, but I also had come to understand by the end of doing the thesis how overdetermined everything was by the way in which the history of the Zulu kingdom and the idea of Shaka had been taken up in subsequent generations. And I felt until I'd unspooled all of that and understood how Shaka had been produced and reproduced over time, including in the things which seemed the most pristinely archival, including in oral traditions. If I didn't understand how that had been happening between the time of Shaka and my writing, I mean, how could I cite something in a footnote? I couldn't. So that's what the PhD was an attempt to understand some of the dynamics of the production of that past. But of course, the past is not produced solely by the historians. In fact, the early determining productions of the reign of Shaka, I argued in that book, were made by the early native administrator, as he was termed at the time, Theophilus Shepstone. Why? Because he was seeking a model for colonial indirect rule, in which somehow you had to instantiate an indigenous way of governing, because that would be cost effective and efficient and so on and so forth. So, but it needed to suit the colonial purpose. So there was that big twist of the understanding of the Shakan period. And of course, many things happened after that. The Anglo-Zulu War, so Zulus are now the mighty foe to be respected, and the militarism stuff comes in, and a million other things. At the same time as all that's happening, of course, in local societies, there's support for support for and support against what Shakan rule delivers, or what Shaka's successors, what became the Zulu royal house, what they did. So you had an incredible complexity of the production of Shaka after the fact. That's what the book starts to do, and in particular in the dominant and mostly white streams. But not only that, but mostly, because that's where the big overdetermining and comes in a particular line. So I think that the thesis and the terrific Majesty book are about that, the making of ideas and the making of an archive of the Shakan period that happens after the fact.
In between those 2 points, you returning to South Africa, and there's a very interesting item in your biography where you become a speechwriter for Nelson Mandela, and just wondering how you managed to pull that coup off and how it fed back into your academic work. You edited the Mfecane Aftermath in 1995. So how did you bridge that? What were you up to in those early 90s?
Thula, that was really, as a word that I use a lot, is contingent. That was an accident. The house that I lived in with my partner was a house full of political activists. And at the point when Mandela was well, actually the story starts with the release of Walter Sisulu. Suddenly Walter Sisulu was about to be released. And it threw local activists here into a tailspin because there's so much to do. You have to organize a rally, you have to arrange security, you have to get support. There's a million things that have to be done. In addition, he has to come out of jail and give a speech. And, he was somewhat elderly and frail. And someone had to spend time with him thinking about how he would deliver his first speech. And there I was, sort of, somebody who is not, I mean, I'm not a political follower or a joiner. So I'm not the kind, I think I'm the person who always has to ask millions of critical questions, and therefore one can't easily become part of a political party. So I was a non-party member of anything, but with a deep historical interest and a great interest in discourse, in how to speak. So I just got assigned to go to Walter Sisulu's little house in Soweto and work with him to develop a speech for his first public appearance, which was actually at Wits. It was organized there. It was I've forgotten the event. Anyway, so there I was. So I had, heavyweight internal political people telling me what they thought he should say and so on and so forth. And of course, he had ideas of what he should say. And I had some understanding of how political discourse worked. So the combination of all of that, sat down and tried to write that very first speech, which seemed to go quite successfully. He wasn't a natural public speaker, so there was also quite a lot of, and I mean, it was pretty out of condition, I mean, you've been in jail for 20 years, so, it's not easy. There were questions of new glasses, for example, because you have to be able to read your speech, but you also have to be able to see people. And, how fashionable are you going to be or aren't you going to be? So there were funny questions. And then there's the matter of syntax, that a speaker has a particular syntax that they're comfortable with. And they can't always say what the political line wants the thing to be said because it's not a natural speaking syntax. So I suppose I had the patience and the interest to work on this early speech. And then I was just retooled because, the next thing is Madiba's out and someone has to write all those early speeches because remember the heavyweight ANC exiles are not back yet. So I did a lot of that. And then I was ousted by Raymond Suttner, who felt that I was not, my ideas were not pure enough and it wasn't coming out as it should be coming out. So Raymond took over and eventually he was ousted by incoming foreign exile speechwriters. So, but I did write the Mandela Natal speech, the one where he says, you throw your guns and knives in the sea.
Did you come up with that line? Sorry, I have to ask.
I did with some trepidation because it's first of all, it was a big shock to everyone that Mandela was going to take the position of accommodation that he decided to. So that presented its own difficulties because how do you, in a rhetorical way, both acknowledge an immediate 1980s incredibly painful and divided history, but also let people feel that they can move forward. So, the rhetorical things that have to be done in the speech to not to compromise, when you can't pretend to do something, that's not true to the past, but find the way forward. But there was also the question of where is the possibility of redemption? And in some senses, the sea is a pure place, yeah, in local thinking, I think. So, but it was never convinced it was quite the right formulation. But, the final speech was written the night, the words were finally decided on the night before. It was all very tight.
But but still, Carolyn, there are so many layers here in terms of your awareness of language and the nuances. And yes, speaking to that, because I mean, I grew up with the rhetoric around the Anglo-Boer War, as it was called in my context at the time, and driving the Tommies into the sea. It's like driving the unwanted into the sea is actually a recurring metaphor in South Africa. So turning that metaphor on its head is really something special. Probably that's why that line has stuck. But then at the same time, I can't help but think of, you can't make this up. It's almost like Forrest Gump in the sense that here you are, you have dissected the myth making around Shaka, and I think the other South African figure with the most myth around him is Madiba. And you were there in different senses with or engaged with the myth around both of them.
Lindie, on the sea question, I thought of the sea question in terms of things that discussions I'd had endlessly in Eswatini, in what was then Swaziland. And also the work that I'd been doing in this early period, in which the sea is a place of the seawater has potency and a certain element of purification. And I think that a lot of people listening to the speech would understand seawater in that way. Whether it's a place that can hold guns and knives is a more complicated proposition, when that's what gave me the real agony in that formulation. So it's Madiba liked it. Let's put it that way. He said it did, and he wanted it. Yeah. But then myth is not a word I'm particularly interested in. And there are other people who write books, like The Invention of Shaka and so on and so forth. I'm not interested in myth or invention, because I don't think that's how the process works. I think the process is a complexity between public and political discourse and academic discourse and practice and archive and memory. And I think that these work in an iterative spiral across time. So I would say that academic and public and political discourse and practice shape what we think of as archive and memory shape those practices and those discourses. And to think of it as myth is to think of it in a much more linear and instrumental way. And it also puts the historian outside of that, as though the historian is the one who deconstructs the myth making, right? I don't think that explains the dynamic of how a figure like Shaka or a figure like Mandela comes to be invested in all the things that they are. There are all sorts of things going on all the time that are, and that's why I call it an iterative spiral through time, because all of those things are at work. So I wouldn't think of either of them. I mean, I understand, of course, that in one sense there is myth making. But at another level, if you really want to understand the complexity of the making of, the understanding of either of those people or of their times, then you have to understand the production. I think I always come back to the word, the production of these ideas across time.
I love that.
In the next section, go into the production of two of your books, and the first one we'd like to speak about is an edited one that you oversaw, and it's a response to a major contributor to the field of, the Mfecane and Julian Cobbing. And how did you get to be the editor of that? What was the process of that Wits University Press edited book?
Thula, I was just ridiculously young at the time to be doing this, but Julian Cobbing produced his arguments in a couple articles. And as people who know the debate know well, the core of the argument was to say I'm going to pronounce this without any clicks in it because that's the inflection of the tongue. The Mfecane, right? Let's call it that for the moment. He was the idea of the Mfecane, as it was called, was imagined as originally as set in motion by Shaka. So Shaka, the empire, has his big empire, and it sets off this domino effect, and then all these things go, there's tumultuous effects all over the show. And then Julian Cobbing says, now hold on a minute. That's a settler alibi. What really causes this, he argues, is that there's white slave raiding and other land grabbing, and that sets in motion all of these things. So because I have that complex idea about a myth, right, as we've just discussed, that even in the very young me, that didn't rest well, because what about all these accounts? Many of them recorded in African languages. Some, for example, written by the sons of Mashweshwe, in which, or these accounts recorded in isiZulu. When something with Mfecane, with a little click in it, Mfeka, all sorts of words are used to explain something that these writers and commentators are trying to get across. Clearly, there's a whole idea that they have. What produces their idea? So I felt anxious about the simplicity of what Julian Cobbing was saying. In addition, as other historians pointed out, the slave raiding evidence was thin and fragmentary, not sufficient to carry the weight. And the land dispossession per se is a bit later in time. So not quite work, but on the other hand, he had something at the core there. He also published another article in which he dismissed something like the James Stewart archive, as he called it, a tainted well. So it's a colonial source, you can't trust it. And I thought to myself, I don't know that understands the full complexity of all of this. So I thought, well, these ideas are running away with everyone, and why don't we have a conference and a big debate about it? So I organized, with all the youthful arrogance of a 20-something-year-old, I organized this conference and put it on. And of course, there was huge debates and so on and so forth. And the University of Natal and Wits Press actually both published that book. They both published because they couldn't agree amongst themselves about who would be the right publisher for it. And I said, well, why can't you both publish it then? And I was the editor. Then Julian Cobbing decided that he was not going to publish his paper in it, even though he'd given it at the conference, because certain other papers, he wanted certain kinds of editorial control. And I said, no, we can't have that because it's a debate. And, I'm for bits of your argument and against bits of your argument, but there are other people who are virulently against, and they are going to be in the book, and you should be in the book. And anyway, he decided he didn't want to publish his paper, and he withdrew his paper. And so the book got published with all these multiple papers, all responding either to him or to aspects of somebody else's argument and so on. Interestingly, it's my conclusion, Lindie and Thula, that very few people can actually read that book, because each of the historians who writes there is someone who knows an area very well. But if you try to understand the full complexity of it, it's so demanding and so difficult that it's, I think, a very tough read, which is why we have these little introductory sections where someone tries to guide you through each section. So it was heated, it was difficult, the characters were difficult. Thula, I think I bit off more than I could chew, to quote you. But, it found its way into press, and yeah.
Then, okay, from that, your next is Terrific Majesty, which you've mentioned before. Terrific Majesty, the powers of Shaka Zulu and the limits of invention. I mean, we've spoken about this more, you know, the critique of myth making, which I like very much. But you published this book in 1998. Tell us about it, and also tell us about publishing it through Harvard University Press.
Well, I finished it. I finished writing it. I had a 3-month visit to the US where I had to try and finish writing the thesis, actually. And so I sort of rushed through the thesis, finished it, defended it, and so on. And then a friend who was a bookshop owner was, I think, a good friend of Lindsay Waters, who was one of the commissioning editors at Harvard. And my understanding is that he sent the thesis to him, and then Lindsay approached me and said, would you like to submit it to Harvard? Which I did, and then I had some very interesting reviewers, one of whom was Anthony Appiah, whose comments were just fantastic. But by then I'd come back to South Africa, and I was working in the anthropology department, and you know, I found it was difficult to find the time to turn the thesis into a book, and finally I sort of managed to do it, and it's pretty much the same argument as the PhD, but much slimmer and more condensed. And yeah, and so there it was. And, you know, the subtitle of it is The Limits of Invention. And that is really what I'm very interested in, because I'm interested in this process. You see, I don't think the past, even when it's, well, obviously there are very crude forms where people simply produce a fake version of the past to suit themselves. But, you know, over time, counter arguments are always put forward and things happen. And so I don't think the past is invented. I don't think the Mfecane was invented. I think something happened. What it is of great interest, and it's not explicable simply as the disruptions that result from the emergence of the Zulu kingdom under Shaka. Not at all. I've got a very different argument, which I'm hoping John Wright and I will soon bring out in a book. But the Terrific Majesty book it has another component to the title, and that's the powers of Shaka Zulu. And that's not about the powers of the man. It's about the idea and what the potency of the idea, and how that potency plays itself out over time, which one could say is a similar question when it comes to Madiba. Yeah. So in a way, the book is about the making of an archive, but not an archive as an inert or set in stone, you know, a repository, a lovely dusty place where everything's immobilized, but an archive is something that's very active in public and political life.
But then also, I mean, you're back in South Africa now, and I'm thinking of your earlier experiences as a student at Wits, in which you were somehow not quite in step with the major strands. And the late 90s, early 2000s, it's the heyday of postmodernism. And then some radical scholars interpret your book as such. What do you think about that?
Well, I was amused because I wondered what it could possibly mean. You know, what did they think postmodernism meant? Radical relativity? I don't know. I don't think I'm a radical. I mean, if anything, I'm a very, very detailed methodologist. I want to know how we know, and I always want to track the context of production. Is that postmodern? I don't think there's pastiche in my work, another hallmark of the postmodern. I'm very attentive to change over time. which I think is fundamental to a historical method. So I was a bit flabbergasted, and I thought in a way that it was a way of consigning me. And because I think my ideas worried at certain of the assumptions that were taken for granted by the established historical profession in South Africa in particular. Maybe much less so in other parts of the world, but there was a congealedness, I think, in the certainty and authority of the social historians. And that idea that even their own ideas were just a product of their time, and that their sources were also a product of particular production process, wasn't something that was well received. There was a lot of, I think, arrogant self-confidence, very little attention to strands of African thinking. And so I was marginal, deeply marginal, and equally marginal, I think, to anthropology.
You were at the center of the establishment, though, and at Wits. And how did it affect your relations with colleagues at the history workshop and the history department, if that's not too sensitive an issue? This whole categorization of you by some as a postmodern historian, did that affect that relationship at all? How did you interact with them?
Well, the Wits history department's not big on employing women and engaging with women. So there was that component, which also has to be thought about. My interest in these earlier periods was of no particular interest to anyone there. And my methods were, I think, quite challenging. So by the 2000s, I think the history department was wondering which way it should go. And a lot of people became interested in heritage and public history. And I had a parallel interest. You see, I'm not sure what I'm curious about the idea of popular history, and I've had a long critique of the ease with which History Workshop imagined historians would produce popular history for consumption by the popular masses out there, because I see this as a much more dynamic process in which some people produce something and other people listen to it and then they produce something and so on. So that sort of one-way process and the understanding of popular history as going out from the academy was something that I felt a bit hesitant to buy into wholesale. I was also realized that my understanding of oral history was rather different from their understanding of oral history. And I think that their understanding of oral history was to see oral history as source. So a source and sources that could be mined for mostly social and economic facts. Of course, people were interested a bit in forms of popular culture and what they might show. And I recognize that. So I was a little bit at odds, and it wasn't easy. I didn't fit entirely with the idea of public history, or heritage, which was, well, now we should go and become involved in the production of public history. Let us do the museum displays or whatever it is. Because I think I'm interested in history in public life, which is a different thing entirely, which is, yes, the academy produces, other people produce, it's back to that spiral. That's public life, history in public life. So I didn't find it easy to interact with the dominant concerns at the time. But I did do my best to try and find points and to support colleagues who were doing some of that kind of work. But I always thought that maybe I just wasn't able to express my opinion arguments well enough, or maybe they didn't think they were that interesting.
Well, in a sense, I'm thinking of postmodernism and the, Socrates, always asking the very uncomfortable questions and not accepting the accepted truth, I suppose. And someone once said, well, no wonder they made him drink poison. But then on the other hand, apart from, these intellectual academic dynamics, this is also a very interesting time at Wits, if you are comfortable to speak about that, because we're talking about the Makgoba period, and there was quite a bit of turbulence in the wider institution. What are your recollections of that time?
So, what the dominant thought that I had at the time was the way in which I thought the African studies scholarship of the time was seemed to have very little engagement with the rest of the continent, very little understanding of African intellectual debates that were going on, and hence not easily able to understand certain of the gaps in our own thinking. So we had this very established, authoritative and self-confident sort of left-wing, largely white, but not exclusively, but largely white, social science and history producing academy at a place like Wits. And I think that the Makgoba years, Makgoba came in with his own ideas of, well, we have to become a little bit more African, and with a certain and in some respects, his political approach was perhaps a little naive. He was a medical person primarily, and to engage in this sort of stuff, you needed the depth of immersion that something like the African Literature Department had at Wits, right? We really were engaging with all these discussions and dealing with them. So, he ran headlong into people like Charles van Onselen and others who had no interest in the kinds of questions that he was trying to put forward. And I don't think he was sufficiently skilled to find and build the intellectual alliances that might have made some aspects of his agenda go forward. And, then people, of course, climb on board with any administrative weaknesses and battles play themselves out. I was more alarmed by the way in which subsequently Colin Bundy came in, inaugurated a set of changes, and then left abruptly. Because I think they left, he inaugurated a set of changes and then left them floundering. And I think that was, in some ways, as unsettling as what was called the Makgoba affair at the time. That's a point at which I think I lost confidence in university administrations and their capacity to handle with skill the difficulty of navigating universities through what was to come. Yeah, and then there was, of course, the at the same time as all of that's happening, you have the Mbeki presidency taking over, with its particular ways of entering into public discourse and wanting to present a kind of Africanist perspective, and the difficulties that public debate itself started to find itself in, because on what was the footing on which anyone was speaking? How would a sensitive and thoughtful discussion take place? People were hammering at one another. And so the whole question of how debate happens, which continues to be a huge issue today, right, is, I think, it became unsettled. And I think the unsettling has been a good thing, because what really I think happened before was people in authority controlled debate, and in all of this chaos and the difficulties, different people got into authority and controlled debate in different ways, and that's been salutary for all of us. I think it's better than having a dominance that is unquestioned. And I think left-wing scholarship had its own authority and its own dominance, just as much as nationalist rhetoric did in its day.
Can you please tell us a bit about your post-terrific Majesty research? What were you involved in after 1998 and into the early 2000s? You've told us a bit about how you responded against heritage studies, and we're very interested about that because obviously there's the Pretoria department, which had a very different approach to those questions.
Thula, that's when I really began my work on trying to think about what work was the concept of archive doing in the academy and in public and political life, which I find a very complex question. So if I understand archive to be made and remade over time, always, and in active engagement in public and political life, well, how does one think about that? So that led me to hosting a seminar series with colleagues from all over the show, from the National Archives. Remember at the time, the National Archives was full of optimism for being able to deliver new kinds of archives for a new kind of South Africa, and so on. And also thinking about archive well outside the documentary and trying to understand what ideas of archive are expressed through art and so on and so forth. So that led to that Refiguring the Archive book. Now, I think that the Refiguring the Archive book came out well in advance of what has now become, very established as the Archival Turn. And I think it sets some of the terms for understanding that the idea of archive that we had inherited in the 20th century was well worth reconsideration in all sorts of ways, and a variety of things have happened since then. The thing that I'm most interested in is the extent to which it prefigured what for the decolonialists post Rhodes Must Fall and Fees Must Fall, what they think you have to do to archive, because they are clear that the inherited archive is limited and it's a problem in all sorts of ways. But when it comes to the early history in particular, their main capacity has been to imagine an archive effectively, or to find it in inherited wisdom. Right? But I think the Refiguring project, which is one that I've been interested in ever since then, really suggests that one can go beyond all of that and take all this inherited stuff, and by reworking it in various ways, experimentally and not necessarily authoritatively, it doesn't mean that we know exactly how to do it. But if you refigure it and you take it out of its colonial figurations, the inherited colonial figurations, what happens? Because the material is stuff that does, a lot of it is stuff that has fabulous histories of its own. And it's open to that kind of refiguring. So I've stayed deeply invested in that Refiguring project. And the project that I work on with the most interest today is the digital archive, because the digital archive allows you to take things from all over the show and experiment with those things, placing them in new contexts or new configurations, and seeing what those configurations with all sorts of digital affordances allow you. So, for example, you can take texts from all over the world in African languages, written, say, in the 19th century, Southern African languages, let's say, you can put them, you can digitize them, you can make them searchable, you can put them online, you can handle the problem of varied orthographies because it's often pre-standardized. And you could, let's go back to the term that we used earlier. Like, let's say Isizwe, you could take a term like Isizwe and you could generate instantly online a fully dated usage of that term in texts over 100 years. So suddenly you have the archive of the usage of the term Isizwe in a variety of African languages. I mean, the kind of intellectual resource that that offers is just extraordinary. Because you've got it now, you've dated all your text, you can search all your text, you can find it in one sentence in a novel. You've got the usages. It's just suddenly the archive is totally transformed.
And one should consider, but I also, as I listen to you, and one realizes, again, the possibilities, but also the extent to which we need to consider this very deeply in how we train our students, and I suppose in a sense retrain ourselves for a wider, I think a wider archival landscape, to call it that.
Yeah, I often think the issues that come up for the early history stuff are not particular to the early history. They just show the issues in very sharp relief because the problems are so exaggerated, as it were. But many of the things that we're talking about are absolutely crucial for the well-documented past.
True, very true. But then I would like to know, we're talking about the archive and the public, but I think it was 2002, it was still RAU, which is today UJ, that the Historical Association Conference at the time focused on history and heritage has been, at one point, I think in the early 2000s, seen as a lifeline for history. And then there were questions, are there tensions between them or not? But I would like to know what is your, for part of your engagement with that. Also, if one considers your involvement with, let's say, for example, the Robben Island Museum, and then, yes, archives and the public. I would like to drill a bit more into the heritage component.
So, because heritage is not something I'm particularly interested in, I understand that it's there and that it plays an important role in public life, right? There are a lot of people who are invested in it, they want this to work in a particular way, and they put their energies and resources into those things. I've thought it necessary for my little spiral to understand as much as I can about heritage projects and how they work, because they affect my spiral in a substantial way. So they are the object of my interest. Being on the Council of Robben Island was not easy for me because it was an exercise in the presentation of a certain kind of heritage, which I'm not particularly interested in. The part of the work that I was very interested in is the matter of archives. So at one point, the Robben Island Museum sought to ingest part of elements of UWC archives, the struggle archives. And then the question of, well, what happens when that happens and it's involved in a heritage project and how do you do it and so on became of interest. And I realized that my interests and concerns about archive didn't sit well with a council that took its responsibilities to produce a particular version of struggle history. And so I eventually thought it's best I resign from here because in some ways my concerns are not their concerns. And in fact, I feel the same way about but we can talk about that later. Whereas in the matter of the South African History Archive or the Gay and Lesbian Archive, I was very interested in the question of what it means to try to give certain material the status of archive. Because once it's got the status of archive, it demands preservation in posterity. That's what the conferring of the title of archive is. Lindie, if I said to you, all those diaries you've got of your grandfather in the attic, they're your archive. Immediately I say that to you, you think, tee up, am I going to toss them out tomorrow as planned? Because if you do, you can, of course. But by saying that, I've given them a status that you have to actually go against before you can throw them away. As soon as you've decided they're an archive, you think, well, how are my descendants going to inherit these? How are we going to preserve them? Actually, it's leaking up there. I better do something about it, right? So in both those instances, I was deeply interested in the practice of conferring the status of archive and what it creates. So, and of course, in both cases, there were collections collections or possible collections in the case of the Gay and Lesbian Archive, because there was no collection. It had to be conjured, as it were, into being. I was interested in all of those processes and how they would enter the public domain and make certain things available. Yeah, so that was my real interest in that kind of work.
You then became an editor in one of the major post-94 historiographical projects, which is the Cambridge History of South Africa. First volume appears in 2009. Can you tell us a bit about the project and your experiences of it and getting towards publication?
So I think that in deciding on the editors, I think the Cambridge commissioning editor probably thought, well, we need a woman, we need a Black person, and we need someone who's experienced in overviews. And so I think I filled the woman category. And I found it, and I was pretty, I'm a kind of person who normally when I'm in a project, I just get on with the delivery. I'm a driver of projects. And in the particular case of the Cambridge history, I said, look, I'll do this, but I don't want to be the driver. This is because I was just become a mother, and I knew that I didn't want to do all that. I had my hands full. And it languished, I think, for a long time. And that, Lindie, goes to the matter of the stereotype of, the women almost always do the administrative and secretarial work and get things going. So I found it a project without strong drive and administration, but with talented scholars. But I found myself at odds, extremely at odds with some of my aspects of one of my fellow editors. And eventually I suggested that we divide the editorship for Volume 1 and Volume 2, and that I work on Volume 1, and that in this case it was Bill Nasson, who had rather different ideas about what the scholarship should look like, work on Volume 2. So that led to a little bit of a division there. And it was quite a complicated question, because the Cambridge history positions itself as a magisterial overview. But were we really in a position to do a magisterial overview of, let's say, the deep history of Southern Africa and the early colonial history? Yes, to some extent, there'd been scholars working mostly in the 80s. So I thought there were elements of Volume 1, which I was involved in, which depended very heavily on older scholarship, and bringing in some of the newer thinking was not readily received by older scholars. So yeah, so it was quite a difficult and fraught process, and I understand that volume 2, which took longer to come out and so on, was even more fraught. But, I don't really know the details of that. But yeah, it was, I enjoyed, in the end, I enjoyed the production of volume 1.
And then you also moved from Wits to UCT. Was it in 2009?
Yeah.
And that you went from an anthropology department now to history. So tell us about the shift from Johannesburg to Cape Town, but also from an anthropology department to a history department.
Well, actually, Lindie, I was offered a chair at UCT, right? This is the South African Research Chair. They was only loosely sort of said in archive. And they weren't certain what department this should be in, because, of course, the question of archives is not just of interest to historians. And so there was a possibility of going to African Studies or to anthropology. There was something called there is still something called the Center for Curating the Archive in the Art School and the History Department. I chose the Anthropology Department because the Anthropology Department had a wonderful cohort of scholars who I thought were asking some incredibly interesting questions about the production of knowledge and about the environmental humanities and the medical humanities. And I really liked the context of all of that. So I actually moved to an anthropology department. And then subsequently, there were been big changes in the history department. And Bodhi Sattva Kar came in and became the head of the department and effected quite a change in the history department, making it, in my view, much more interested in global questions and much more interested in African intellectual history, and much more and overtly hospitable to the using of sources in African languages, which had not been the case in that department. So it became a suitable place, and a couple of years, I don't know, when I moved, I can't remember, maybe 2017, something like that. I can't remember. I moved departments and have loved being in a history department, which is where I think I really belong.
Well, at the time, I was supervising a PhD student working on the history of the Zambian archives. We were on your website almost daily, just because of the incredible resources that you produced and made accessible, to other scholars interested in the archives.
Thank you, Lindie.
But then I would also like to know, you joined the Nelson Mandela Foundation's Board of Trustees in 2015. And of course, the Nelson Mandela Foundation is also synonymous among historians for its archive and its consciousness of that. So please tell us a bit about your role in the foundation.
So I had long worked with archivists in the Nelson Mandela Foundation because of their interest in not simply the Mandela archive, but in questions of archive. So a lot of two of the big collaborators in the Refiguring the Archive book had been Vern Harris and Razia Saleh, and they were both at the Nelson Mandela Foundation. I also worked very closely at the time with Njabulo Ndebele, because a lot of my collaboration and I think some of my closest intellectual companionship has been with people in African literature. And in particular, Becky Peterson actually has been was a particularly valued colleague. In fact, yes. Anyway, so I think that Njabulo then decided that having me on the foundation as a trustee would be a good idea, and they invited me to join, which I did, Lindie, with some hesitation, because I wondered what it was to defend a legacy of a person, and I realized that the foundation, for much of its good work, was involved in defending that legacy. But the part of the work that I liked very much was its foundational project, which was in fostering dialogue. And because I'm so interested in public debate and discourse and discussion and how that happens, I thought this was a worthy place to be. So I was prepared to lend my support to that with some anxiety about the legacy of the great man. I mean, not that I have any particular interest, like support or critique of Mandela as a great man or otherwise. Those are not really the questions that interest me. I'm not particularly interested in the greatness or otherwise of Shaka either. I am interested in how all that stuff works. Eventually, I resigned from the board because it became increasingly clear to me that the project of democracy itself was in crisis. And the time, in uttering this in, say, I don't know, 2015 or whenever, I can't remember when I did, for the first time in the board, it was such a shock because you can't have a trustee of the Nelson Mandela Foundation saying, I'm not convinced about the future of democracy. It's just not, it's too difficult for the foundation. You can imagine the headlines. Oh, trustee says democracy, whatever. So I thought, actually, my thinking is too independent and too problematic for it to be of it could potentially imperil the trustees. So I thought it was better if I resigned and then felt free to carry on my own critical discussions without causing them any danger. So.
Okay, well, that would have been in 2015 and 2016, and that would have involved the foundation taking a conscious decision not to get involved in the Defend Our Democracy movement. There's all sorts of interesting things. I mean, it's many other civil society organizations were speaking out, and you might have thought that Nelson Mandela Foundation would have thought themselves as being, we need to be on the front line of this. It's not as obvious as to me listening, as you thought it would seem to me hearing when you said in 2015 the Nelson Mandela Foundation would have not felt any particular need or urgency to come out in defense of democracy at the height of state capture.
That's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying it didn't feel the defense of democracy. I'm saying my critique of the operations of democracy,
right,
which took a different character from much of the defense of democracy argument. Right. I thought it was not. I didn't think there was easy space for it in the foundation and in the foundation's public profile. Yeah. So I have a book called Babel Unbound, which came out a little bit later. And the Babel Unbound talks about the way in which, for example, certain things which are taken for granted as media freedoms, in fact, orchestrate public debate in particular ways. And I think that the failure to grasp the way in which there's a certain amount of policing in public debate is why we end up in so much difficulty today. So I thought that my critique of the operations of free speech and my critique of what the operations of democracy and of the institutional environments that were very confident of the way in which they defended democracy, I thought would not go down easily, and that there wasn't the room for the nuanced perspective that I wanted to put out in the book form, Babel Unbound, in where it's all laid out and use time and the capacity to make the argument. What is the critique and why? Can we really show that media orchestrates debate? You have to show it. You can't just claim it. You have to show it, and you have to show how it works in a particular setting, which I think the book does.
I was very impressed when you brought out the report on the state of the archives, which was actually a bit of a harrowing report, and then the work in relation to the archival platform. So could you tell us a bit about your activist work around the archives in the 2000s and 2010s and its impact?
Lindie, I don't believe that one can have the luxury of just critique. I think you've got to give alternatives, and you've got to try and get in there and do some of the work. So that's part of it. I mean, I think it's all very well to write a book like Refiguring the Archive, and you give all the theoretical stuff, but can you actually do it, right? And if so, what does it take? And that's hard work, and that's why I do the digital project, because I think you know it's fine to have the critique, but get out there and do something differently. I think the same way, it's all very well to be saying, oh, well, you know, these archives or whatever your critique of them is. But actually, what's going on the ground? You know, it's all very well us criticizing certain things about an archive, but what about these financial constraints? And what about the limits, and who's policing what, and how does it work? You know, you have to do some of the actual hard work in public life. You have to get out there and kind of put your money where your mouth is. That said, I want to say that the archival platform work and those reports owe everything to two of my colleagues, in particular Joanne Duggan, but also Mbongiseni Buthelezi, who's now CEO of the Mandela Foundation, because they really, I mean, I raised the money for it, and I ran those projects and so on, but they really did a great deal of the footwork in speaking to people and coming to understand where the weak spots were and why they were there, and attempting to put them out. You know, these were all open reports so that they were out in public life. Many historians, both of you will know this, you know, clutch their hair and say, oh, the archives are in such a bad state. Do they do anything? You know, it's hard work. It's hard work to do something in response to the crisis in the archives. I'm a little bit impatient with all critique and no do.
In your engagement, you've always linked the archive and public culture, and I just wondered, how would you, let's take the archive out because we've spoken quite a bit about that for the moment. How would you assess the state of public culture with regards to how it relates to the archive, that dimension?
Thula, I'm not that comfortable with public culture. That was sort of, in the end, a compromise that was put on that chair by the university, right? And the people who invited me to apply for the chair. I really think of it as public life, and I don't have expertise in public culture. It's huge. You know, I mean, I can't tell you about opera and dance and all the many things, theatre and so on, that are involved in public culture. Although I am interested all the time when archive comes into a manifestation of something in public culture. So I have a sort of a narrow area of engagement there, which is what is public culture making of the past, and why is it making of the past in that particular way at this particular time? What's it doing? So I've then become interested, if you have a dance and you've invoked some aspect of the past in your dance, what does it mean to do that in dance? What is the body able to do? So then I become interested in the medium. What is the performative aspect of that? What does that do? Why are people choosing to do that? What is the affect? What is affect in a form of public culture allow us to understand about the past that reason and footnotes alone don't? Yeah. So those are that's, if I have an interest in public culture, it's where history is the subject or the topic of the manifestation in public culture, but always in context and of course the idea of circulation is absolutely crucial to all the work that I do, because if you do take on board some aspect of the past and use it in a dance performance, the dance performance is performed to an audience that night. But then you, Thula, were watching the performance that night, and then you go home and you talk about it to your family over dinner, and you say, gosh, I saw this dance performance. it was about this aspect of the past, and then it did this. And then actually maybe someone who's at dinner talks to someone else, and a newspaper and a review is written, and suddenly that aspect of the past is in a whole public discussion at your dinner table, but also in the review that came out in some, maybe on social media somewhere or whatever. And there's a public engagement happens. The dynamics of that interest me enormously. And I've worked with Diteko Modisane and Rory Bester on a paper which it's a published essay now, which is on a method of how to track ideas in public life that appear in these cultural forms.
I really love that, but also just to think of all the strands you bring together. And you mentioned it earlier in terms of the students that you have trained. You invest a lot in interdisciplinary postgraduate pedagogy. And can you tell us about what that is involved and the benefit you feel that this has for training historians?
So I think that history as a discipline has got a very distinct channel that it trains students in. And I think that that channel has limitations of archive, especially in our context in Southern Africa. So what I notice is that those students in dance understand that there is an embodied archive and an archive in movement and performance, a repertoire, let's call it that, because there is a big theorist here, Diana Taylor, who talks about performance repertoires as archive. Now, those students with their disciplinary training are able to access these ideas of archive in repertoire and in performance and in dance moves in a way that the history student in the silo of history wouldn't necessarily think of that archive as an archive that's available to the historian. But the student in the dance discipline doesn't easily have access to all the understandings of archive and the kinds of sources that are available to the history-trained student. Put those students together in a workshop situation regularly over time, not just once, because they've got to learn to hear each other. They've got to understand that what the word discourse means in the history discipline is not necessarily the same as what it means in poetry, right? There are slight differences in the use of the term and in the practice. So being able, in a situation where we are constrained by an authorized archive, which is largely a result of colonialism and apartheid, but not exclusively, the ability to widen your archival scope and to be able to work across those disciplines in a mutually learning way is utterly invaluable. Right? So that's, but how to do that? Because it's hard enough to train students in disciplines. And I'm absolutely convinced the students have to know their own discipline very well before they can start wandering out. So they have to be in their discipline, but they also have to have sustained opportunity to have cross-disciplinary conversations. And it requires colleagues. I have to have the dance professor coming to the workshop as well, because the dance student sometimes is not yet familiar enough with everything that they need to know to be able to have this cross-disciplinary discussion with the history student. So sometimes you need the professors, and sometimes you need the students to gang up against the professors, right? Which they do, which is when you overturn an old orthodoxy, and it's fantastic. So I think that graduate study should never be, or it's very difficult as a long, lonely slog of your own, which is the historian's standard process. But for certain aspects of historical research, that being able to be in that wider context and to throw your archival net wider, but to be able to do so in a strongly supported way, that's really crucial. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about how to have the pedagogy that is discipline-rooted, deeply and profoundly discipline-rooted, but able to benefit from cross-disciplinary engagement. And that for me has been in workshops where students and professors both present their work, because I think it's very good for professors to get the critique of these younger thinkers, and where you have multiple disciplines offering their work up for cross-disciplinary critique. I think that's, but it's difficult. It's difficult to do that. It's very demanding. It's very difficult to get, sometimes I have workshops in which we're dealing with early histories of Southern Africa and 21st century performances of dance. And it's very difficult for the student who's on a 21st century performance of dance to have a conversation with someone who's studying the Mthethwa kingdom under Dingiswayo. It's like, wow, these are pretty diverse elements. But in fact, they are our world. And I think you have to be able to think across those dimensions.
I think in that case also, as you said, not just a single workshop, because the more interaction, the more you open up the possibilities for finding the connections, because they might not be obvious initially, but they will emerge eventually.
You have to learn to hear each other.
Yes.
Yeah.
What have been your 3 favorite or impactful, the ones that have had the academic scholarly books that have had the greatest impact on you?
So it won't surprise you that I'm going to say David Cohen's book, The Combing of History. That's that production of history paper, the emphasis on production. It's instantiated in his book, The Combing of History. And I think that Rolf Trio's The Silencing of the Past book, which I also think is very influential, owes a lot to those ideas about the production of history and ethnography that were at Johns Hopkins when Trio and Hopkins and Cohen and others were there. So The Combing of History, because it has an understanding of the production of history over time, because the combing metaphor is something where you keep going back over it. And then I would say, surprisingly maybe, Anthony Grafton's book, The Footnote, which is a slim little book, deeply invested in stuff that I don't really know a whole lot about, particularly sort of German historical scholarship, Ranke and the rise of the footnote, and not, because of course what Grafton does is take the history of the footnote way back. He writes a genealogy of the footnote. To write the genealogy of a footnote is to ask us to understand, well, the history of the footnote, and to understand that the footnote is not simply a settled convention of the discipline. It's something which itself has changed over time, and it's used in multiple different ways. And we need to understand that because it's so foundational to our discipline. But do we actually understand that it's something with its own history? So I love the book, The Footnote. And then my third text, I'll name a text, but there are multiple texts that could be in this place, but I'll say the James Stewart Archive, 6 volumes. Why that? Because the published James Stewart Archive is a very particular version of the Stewart papers that exist in the Killie Campbell Africana Library. It's one with which, that particular version is one with which I dispute all the time. But what it is across those 6 volumes is that it gets you going with the reading of those archival papers, which are not readily available for reading and rereading, right? Because you can't, I mean, how many hours can you spend in the Killie Campbell Library with the handwriting? And the more you read and the more you reread, the more you come to understand the project of Stewart, the project of the multiple people he's speaking to, the nature of his English, the nature of his renditions of their isiZulu, or just all of those sorts of things, so that the question of what it can and can't enable in terms of going back to the actual papers themselves and to all of those people who spent hours in conversation with him, who journeyed to his home and spent New Year's Day with him often, or Christmas Day, sitting on his veranda talking about topics related to the deep past. What were they doing? Why were they doing it? This wasn't part of his official duties. This was Christmas Day or New Year's Day. How is that happening? How are they coming back? Why were they staying for 3 days? It's one of those, it's the inexhaustible activity of the historian who can read and reread the source again and again, different iterations. And by the way, in my digital project, we have taken the published volumes and stitched digitally the original handwritten notes to the published volume pages. So we have made a digital object where you can search the word nation, if you like. So keep using the one example we've been using. You can use the word nation, and you can find all the places it occurs in English in the published volume. It's all typed up, easily searchable. And then you can just flip online. It's not online because the Kitty Campbell doesn't yet allow that, but when they will, I hope they'll allow it. You can just flip and see the original isiZulu. And imagine when we're able to convince them to allow us to put this online. Anyway.
Imagine.
Yeah.
Oh, and then finally, what are you working on at the moment?
A couple of things, Lindie. John Wright and I have a book contract with Cambridge University Press. We're nearly done with it, and I think it's a book that's primarily about method. So its topic, but the topic in some sense is incidental. Its topic is a whole lot of political formations that exist before the Zulu Kingdom, and then finally the Zulu Kingdom, under Shaka, the early years of the Zulu Kingdom. So there's that, and I have another manuscript on the go, which I'll attend to afterwards, but it's mostly written, which would be if one approaches the question of archive from our positioning, not from Ranker's positioning or a European positioning, but from our positioning, how might the concept both inhibit what we do as historians and enable? And what are the tactics for dealing with the concept that we are given by centuries of a discipline? Right? So that's a book about archive itself. And finally, I want to write about a dramatic episode in my own family life for which there's almost no evidence.
For the second one, you said us, we, and we are not Ranker. Who's the we?
Who are we?
You were mentioning that.
We who are historians who write in Southern Africa.
Right.
So it's the challenges of archive that we face.
Right.
And the we is multiple, obviously. There are many of us doing different things, but we're not in the same position as European historians. We don't have the particular historiographies that they have behind them. We're aware of theirs. They are less aware of ours. But our particular circumstances bring certain questions to the fore very sharply that they sometimes see, but sometimes don't. And I'm interested in bringing those questions to the fore and seeing whether we could attract a wider attention beyond our own concerns for those issues.
And then this incident for which there is no evidence?
Oh, well, it's just something in my family history, and I suppose it's probably this is called histotherapy, right?
Historiotherapy.
Historiotherapy. Yeah, so yeah, I suspect that, as for many of us, the things that interest me, which is the problem of evidence, is really my own private and personal mission in life. Yeah.
If your publishers ever ask you to do a description, use the description you've given us, because it's a description that leaves everybody wanting to know what exactly. We must read it.
Exactly. I am extremely curious now, but you reaffirm my assertion that history essentially is also extremely autobiographical. And because it's, where do the questions originate and the questions we continue to ask for the rest of our lives. But Carolyn, thank you. Thank you for your time. And this was fascinating. I can talk to you all day.
Thank you both for listening to all of this and asking amazing questions and so on.
Thank you so much. Yep.
Thank you.